So I thought I'm going to talk a little bit about modeling epidemics. Of course, there's a coronavirus craze out there in the world, and several services are grinding to a halt. Several countries actually grinding to a halt. So obviously I'm not the right person to sort of like to seek proper advice in terms of how you should act in a crisis like this. You should definitely check the proper advice of the country or the region that you're living in. But I figured that actually modeling epidemics, it's a very interesting system dynamics problem. So therefore I thought maybe it would be actually interesting if I went through some of the, let's say, very introductory, very simple ways of modeling an epidemic as a complex system with feedback loops. And of course, I have to mention that basically all of this work has been taken from the MIT System Dynamics course, namely homework 1 of the MIT System Dynamics course. And I have used AnyLogic software in order to create the stock and flow diagrams. So let's start with kind of like conceptualizing this problem a little bit. So when you're trying to model an epidemic, you're basically interested in what percentage of the people are actually infected by the disease and what's there more to come in terms of who else could be infected and what's the end game of the infection. Do people actually recover and develop immunity, or do they end up dying because of the disease? So in system dynamics language, this can be modeled as stocks of people. So in the beginning, you have a large stock of people, which is basically the whole population. And then you can say that the whole population is susceptible to catching the disease. And then some of them will catch it, so they will become infected. So let's start with this. This is the simplest model. So let's say in the beginning, you have a stock of people, which is just let's call this stock the susceptible people who are susceptible to catching the disease. And then at a number of this stock of people per unit of time will get infected. And then they will end up in the infectious stock. So very simply, let's just use a toy example. Obviously, we can calibrate the model later to reflect the actual populations, but let's just use a toy example and say that we're dealing with an initial total population of 1,000 and everybody is susceptible to catching the disease in the beginning. So the susceptible stock of people in the beginning, it's 1,000 people. And then let's say that our infection rate is 5 people per time unit. Let's say that our time unit is a day, and then our simulation runs for 100 days. That's what we depicted up here in the graph, that we have 100 days for the simulation to run. So if I keep running the simulation, of course, what it means that every time unit, I have 5 more people getting from the susceptible stock into the infectious stock. So of course, because this is a constant, right? A constant rate. What that means is that with time, it will be a linear accumulation. So the infectious stock will linearly accumulate, and then the susceptible stock will linearly decrease. And then of course, if I change the infection rate, what that would mean is that the slope of this accumulation will change, because you must remember that the stocks are actually integrals of flows, and an integral of a constant is just a line, right, with a slope specific to that constant. So if I change the constant, basically what will happen is that the slope of my accumulation will change, which of course it means that if I have a higher infection rate, I will get everybody infected faster. So this is how my simulation ends up with if we just use a fixed infection rate that, let's say, what was my infection rate? 18 people. If 18 people per day get infected, then my whole simulation, of course, the 1,000 people get infected in 90 days. Of course, I was changing it over time, so it's not exactly a simple division. So then this would be a very, very basic way of modeling the epidemic. And then, of course, if I change my infection rate, I monitor my infection rate, then I could create a very nice simulation in terms of how people flow from being just susceptible to the disease to actually being infected. But of course, this is not very useful if I want to model a real epidemic. So let's look at something a bit more realistic. So instead of having a fixed infection rate, what we could say that, well, actually, it's the number of people who are getting infected every day. It really does depend on the total number of susceptible people to the infection, which of course initially depends on the total population, but later on it will decrease because those who have already been infected are not susceptible to the disease anymore. So we could say that the infection rate is actually sort of like a percentage of the total susceptible population to be infected, let's say each time unit or each day. So let's say if this percentage is 0.1, then this is how our model will play out. Right? So then what you can of course observe is, let's just save this and start a new one. And then let's increase the context percentage. If you observed in the previous one that now it's not a line anymore, right? It's actually, of course, now I have a huge context percentage, but then the shape of the diffusion of the disease is actually an exponential decay function. And then, of course, that makes kind of sense because once a lot of people are infected, then the remaining people who are still susceptible to being infected is smaller and smaller. So if I'm taking a percentage of that, which is getting smaller and smaller, then my actual infection rate, so the number of people daily getting infected, is less and less. So my disease follows like a nice exponential decay shape. And then if I compare these two curves, this is actually displaying the number of infectious people. Of course, when my contact percentage was higher, I infected everybody quicker. But this is still not the best we can do, because this kind of like thinking in terms of percentages, perhaps it's not the most straightforward. So let's think about actual contacts between people. And then, of course, it's we didn't explicitly include the information that it's not only the remaining people, the susceptible stock who is affecting this infection rate, but also the number of people who are already infected, right? Because the number of people who are already infected, if you get into contact with those people, that actually changes my contact percentage. And now let's call it a contact frequency. So actually the number of people that you get into contact with in a day, let's say, or in a time unit. So now my model gets modified a little bit. So now, of course, I still have my susceptible contacts, which would be, let's say, all the people multiplied with the number of other people that they get into contact on average per day or per time unit. I put a very low value here, just half now, because you will see that actually the disease spreads quite quickly like this with these settings. So contact frequency of half means that you get into contact with one person every 2 days, which of course it's not realistic. But then what actually defines the infection rate is that this number of susceptible contacts, right? So how many potential contacts are happening between the susceptible people. And then, of course, what's the probability that one of those contacts is with an infected person. And we just track the ratio of infected population over the total population. And then we get this actual number of contacts between infected and healthy. So let's say that this is going to be exactly our infection rate. If you get in touch with, if you get into contact with an infected person, bam, you're actually infected. So if I let this model run, we can see that after just 20 days, of course, the disease spread all over and everybody's infected. And then, of course, if I put a more realistic value of meeting, let's say, a couple of people, even just if I put 2 people per day, then the disease in 10 days the whole population is infected. But that's of course because what is happening is that not every contact will carry the disease forward with 100% infectivity. So we have to introduce a parameter called infectivity, which basically will just have to take into account a relatively small percentage of all of these contacts that you would catch the disease. Because not just if you just meet with someone from behind a glass door, then of course you're not going to get the disease, only under certain circumstances. So let's modify our model. We keep everything the same, but perhaps let's put in some more realistic numbers. So let's say that you get into contact with 5 people daily, which is ridiculously low in terms of actual numbers. But in our toy model, it will make sense. And then let's introduce a parameter called infectivity. So now our infection rate is actually a product of infectivity and the contact. So not every contact will directly lead to a new infection, but it's multiplied with an infectivity. And let's say that the infectivity is 3%. So out of 100 interactions, you will catch the disease 3 times. And this is actually a high infectivity for contagious diseases. So then if we run our model like this, then we can see that with an average contact frequency of 5 people per day or 5 people per time unit, we get the entire population infected in 80 days or so. And then, of course, as expected, if we increase our infectivity, let's say to double to what was initially, then of course the entire population gets infected in half the time, so like 40 days. And then, so you see the entire population is infected in half the time. And then this is also true if we increase the contact frequency. So if we increase the contact frequency to a much higher value, then of course the entire population gets infected again much quicker. And then the effect of the higher contact frequency or a higher infectivity on the infection rate in our toy model is pretty much the same. Now you see that I've put 2 loops here, which we call loops, but they are sort of like these characters, which is a feedback loop. And then the R means it's a reinforcing feedback loop, and then the B means it's a balancing feedback loop. So what that means is that if you go around this succession of arrows, and then you see that the arrows actually have signs. So a positive sign means that the 2 quantities are changing in the same direction. And the negative sign means that the 2 quantities are changing in the opposite direction. So we mostly have positive signs here. So a positive sign would mean that, let's say, a higher number of contacts between infected and healthy would lead to a higher infection rate, which of course makes sense. And let's find the negative link. So for example, here, it means that a higher population, of course, it leads to a lower probability of contact with the infected because just the population is higher. So then if you follow this succession of these links, if you find all positive links, then that's a reinforcing loop. So this means that actually this can cause sort of like an inherent growth cycle. So if you have you can just imagine that if you have a higher infection rate, then of course you will have more infected people. And then if you have more infected people, then the probability of getting in contact with an infected person is actually higher. So then if the probability is higher, then the actual number of contacts between the infected and the healthy will also be higher. So then your infection rate will actually be even higher. And then it just keeps increasing like that. So it can have sort of like a runaway effect. But then this loop, it's a balancing loop, because if I go around the arrows like this, in this section I'm going against the arrow, so that would be sort of counted as a negative sign. So that would mean that, well, what is happening is that the more susceptible people I have, there's a higher number of susceptible contacts that I will have. There's also a higher number of contacts between the infected and the healthy, if I have a higher susceptible contacts, which will increase my infection rate in turn, but actually a higher infection rate will decrease. You see that it will like suck away from the susceptible stock. So it will actually decrease my susceptible people. So this loop provides a balancing mechanism, which kind of makes sense because you're sort of like transitioning from susceptible to the infectious state. We will do the same exercise in terms of states using agent-based modeling maybe. So right, so we have a very basic model, but actually what happens after you're infected? Let's see. So after you're infected, what happens is that you recover, let's say. Maybe the disease has a certain runoff period. So how long does it last? Let's call this a duration. This is just in terms of time units. So let's say it lasts for 2 weeks, so 14 days. And then after that, you start recovering. So what will happen is that now people will start flowing between 3 stocks. So we have the susceptible stock, then they will flow to the infectious stock, and then from there, slowly, they will flow to the recovered stock. This is also called a delay, because it will take 14 days until somebody who has just entered the infectious to exit the infectious state and enter the recovered state. Or you can also say that every time unit, 1/14 of the infectious stock will be actually transitioning into or flowing into the recovered stock. So if I run this model, I've tweaked the parameters a little bit. So I've increased the contact frequency a little bit, and then I have kept the infectivity the same. So now on the graph, we will have 3 stocks, right? So now you can see that we have some susceptible people, right? Then they will go into the infectious state, and then after a while, they will start flowing out of the infectious state into the recovered state. And then, of course, after enough time has passed, everybody just recovers. So we end up with initially everybody being susceptible to the disease, then some people have already been infected and they have recovered. Some people have just been infected and they haven't recovered yet. So if I save these results and we do another one, we will see that the infectious will look like this, right? So people are getting infected, and then people are actually starting to recover from the disease. And then the interesting bit is that you can see that the maximum number of the infectious is not equal to the total population. So if there's a recovery mechanism, there might be a case that not everybody gets infected because the disease doesn't get the chance to spread that quickly. So you might end up with somebody who has already recovered, and then, well, in this case, we are assuming that they develop immunity instantly after the recovery. So let's say if of course the duration of the disease is longer, then what will happen is that more and more people will get infected, and then they haven't had the chance to recover yet. So the total number of So the total number of infectious, which is sort of like the maximum width of this curve, you see that the total number of infectious will be actually higher and they will start recovering slower. And then, of course, if my recovery duration is very short, what will happen is that people just almost instantly will recover before even the disease would have had the chance to catch a significant portion of the population. So we don't really care about this, even if a disease is highly infectious. If the recovery time is very, very quick, we don't really care. We just say, you know what, it's fine. It's not worth the effort. People will recover, and then it will not affect the large portion of the population. However, if the recovery time is a bit longer, or the infectivity is very high, such as in the coronavirus case, or various kinds of coronaviruses before, like the MERS or the SARS virus, and then of course we are actually very worried about, you know, maybe we need to control the infectivity, or maybe we cannot really control the infectivity in this case because we don't have enough information about the virus, so we can only control contacts in the beginning. But I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. So, but let's say that, well, actually, not everybody who recovers alive, but there's also a portion of people who will pass away as a result of the virus. So let's introduce fatalities into the model. So if you see, what we did here is that now people who have recovered, actually a certain percentage of them will pass away. So we will also have some kind of a fatality rate. And let's say the fatality rate so far is a couple of percent, 3-4%, which is, I think, the case for the coronavirus. So then what will happen is that people who have recovered, well, immediately, as soon as they flow into the recovered stock, a portion of them will flow out, and then they will just end up in the deceased stock. So of course, I've increased. I kept everything the same and just added a 3% fatality rate. And then what we would expect to see is that 3% of the people who would have been recovered are actually passed away now. So if I speed it up, it's exactly the same situation as we had before, but now we have the people who are recovered, but we also have a very tiny fraction who are passed away. And then if I look at my infectious graph, of course it looks exactly the same as in the previous case, but then what is changing is the recovery part. So, and then of course, if I have a higher fatality rate, let's say 1 in 4 chance of passing away if you caught the disease, then of course the ratio of recovered versus deceased, it's going to be much higher. But then there is even another trick that we can do. Now we are assuming that everybody who's recovered develops immunity instantly and cannot catch the disease again. Well, in most of the cases, for most of the viruses that we know, this might be true. So once your body caught the virus, kind of develops a mechanism to cope with it, and it's not going to catch it doesn't catch it in the future. However, we have already seen multiple examples of somebody who has recovered from having caught the coronavirus catching it again. So let's add another layer of complexity and see how this goes. So you see, what we did here is that now when you recover, well, there's actually a chance that you're going to flow back into the susceptible stock. Of course, a portion of you will still pass away, but then another portion will flow back into the susceptible stock. Let's just call this sort of like a reinfection rate, and then of course there's some kind of an immunity ratio involved with that. So let's say that you have an 80% immunity ratio, which means that 80% of the infectious will recover and 20% will actually flow back into being susceptible again. So then if we look at our model now, of course very similar things start to happen. But then what we can see is that the susceptible stock doesn't go to zero. So there is going to be always a stock of people who are still susceptible at the end of our simulation, and then they have been so for a while. So the disease goes on. So there's always going to be an exchange of how many people are susceptible, how many people are infectious, and how many people are recovered. And then of course if our let's say this was the shape of the simulation with an immunity ratio of 0.8, and if we have a lower immunity, so let's say if you have 60% ratio of recatching the disease, then of course the simulation looks quite different, because then the number of people who will stay infectious is much higher, right? So your disease spread quite a bit faster and just stays like that. So this would be, you just never recover because you're gonna recatch it again. Most of the time this is called the SIR model, so the susceptible, infectious, and recovered model, and it's widely used in socio-technical systems modeling of epidemics. And the interesting bit is that by looking at this very relatively simple model, right, and just looking at a very few numbers, you can create policies of how do you deal with a certain kind of disease. So for example, we have mentioned already that there's just a few parameters and then that control this entire spread of the disease. And then in the beginning, when you don't have a lot of information about a certain kind of disease, then what are your levers, your levers that you can use in order to contain the disease? Well, the only thing that you can do is basically you don't have any effect on the duration of the disease because you don't know how to interact with the disease yet. You don't really have any effect on the fatality rate of the disease until you find out what is actually causing the fatality so that you can combat it effectively. Obviously, you don't really have any effect on the immunity ratio of the disease. And then in the beginning, you also don't have any effect on the infectivity of the disease because you don't know in the beginning how the infection is actually spreading. So the only parameter on which you can act as a society is the contact frequency. And that's why we are seeing quarantines all across the world, because that's the most effective way of actually containing the disease. So if I run this simulation again, and of course I decrease my contact frequency to 0, and then the disease will not spread. But if I just keep it very small, then the spread of the disease is much smaller. So the number of people that will actually be infected, it's very, very small, and then the disease might not spread to the population at all, to larger segments of the population at all. So that's why it's actually very, very important to respect the quarantine rules, because the growth, as you saw, it's not linear, it's exponential. So just decreasing the contact frequency a little bit actually can go a very, very long way in terms of decreasing the total number of people that might get infected. And this relationship is super non-linear. So if you just cut the number of people that you get into contact with in half, the effect of it might be, instead of 100,000 people getting infected, just 5,000 get infected. So this is the tricky part, that the relationships are not linear at all. Now, of course, for diseases that are better known, then you might not have to be, because of course this has a large societal cost, so you might not have to be this radical. So for example, we know that the duration of, let's say, the HIV virus, or the lifetime of it, it's practically infinity. So it follows you throughout your lifetime. So it's not very practical that the quarantine will last for a lifetime then, right? It did happen. So there were examples. So for example, leprosy in the medieval period, which did have also a practically infinite duration, but also a very high infectivity. The only way to do that was lifetime quarantine. And that's why they basically people were shipped to islands, remote islands, to combat the disease. But for AIDS, the infectivity is not very high. Plus, because people know the characteristics of spreading, you can actually artificially lower the infectivity by taking some precautionary measures. So that's why with a different kind of viral disease like HIV, you don't have to quarantine people because you can affect other parameters, namely the infectivity parameter, and then the number of contacts stays the same. I mean, of course, you have some kind of a social campaign to limit the number of contacts, but then that becomes very problematic, right? Because then you start stigmatizing and people cannot live a full life. So rather than going that way, what you end up is actually trying to limit infectivity by taking precautionary measures that would prevent the spread of the virus. So they would actually lower the chance of transmitting the infection. So that's the major difference. Why do you have to suddenly quarantine a lot of people when we have sort of like an unknown virus with a reasonably high infectivity like the coronavirus 2019? So I hope this helps, and I hope that the virus doesn't spread too quickly, too far, and it can be contained. Now, the Johns Hopkins University has a very, very nice website in terms of tracking the statistics at which the virus, the extent to which the virus has already spread in several countries across the world. Obviously, this is true for kind of like each self-contained population unit. So it's valid for a city, that's valid for a country. It's also very valid for the whole world. So that's why you see countries like Italy totally quarantining, or China, of course, quarantining the entire country. Trying to really limit contacts, like shutting down schools and things like that. But also, so people who have not myself, and that's why I'm not actually going to engage in putting the real numbers in the model, because I just want to express it in terms of concept. You see that the curve started to plateau already, but then we don't really know if the quarantine is not effective, then it actually might pick up and then it start to grow again. But then currently it looks like that in mainland China, it has already been contained, and then we should expect to see this decrease in the curve. But then, of course, if we would look at other countries, what we would see is that we are early on in this onset. And then, as I said, this peak, the total number of people that gets infected, it depends on the effectiveness on the quarantine. So basically how much you reduce the contact frequency, because that's the only parameter that you can have an effect upon now.